Hi guys, how you doing? Welcome back to Introduction to Sociology with Dr. John. And today we're talking about racism and ethnocentricity. And these are very important topics, as you probably are aware. In modern society, we live in a society that still perpetuates many different myths about race and ethnicity, and we hope that this will help understand these issues, although we plan to have a course focused exclusively on this issue in the near future. So what is race? What is ethnicity? First of all, race, like gender, is a social construct. It's something that people have created, or society has created, one of the ideologies that exist in modern society. Now, as a concept, like gender, it's based on physical characteristics. In other words, it's the belief that physical characteristics determine social behavioral characteristics. So, for example, all people with dark skin behave in certain ways versus people with light skin, or focusing on the shape of a nose or the color of eyes. So it's the belief that we can categorize people into specific racial groups according to phenotype, what they look like, and that will help us understand their behavior. So certainly people, just like gender is based on sex, yes, people have different phenotype, they have different looks, and these differences are genetic in origin, but the fact that, or the argument that they create or determine behavior, this is what we call the belief in racism. Unfortunately, racism is in itself a product of early misguided scientific development, particularly in the area of biology. So when Charles Darwin developed the theory of evolution to apply to the animal realm, people then took this idea and applied it to different groups of people based on what they looked like. And this was very much tied to what was happening at that period in history in terms of the rise of the nation state and the belief that each nation, which in that time they believed the nation was a racial concept, that the Germans and the French and the English were different races of people. It was also tied at that time to colonialism, and therefore the experience these nations had with other nations in Africa or Asia were determined in part, at least, upon, again, the racial characteristics of each group. Now, in reality, all humans, as we know, originated in Africa. So all the ancestry of human nature is African. So to that extent, all human beings are African. We all originated in Africa. What happened is that some groups migrated out of Africa. So in Africa, you have all the original human groups. Some of those migrated out, not necessarily the better ones, but just some of them. And over time, they adjusted in minor ways to the new environments that they were in. So, for example, going north, dark skin color blocks not sunlight, but blocks the absorption of vitamin D. So since there's less sunlight in the north, you lose the ability to produce vitamin D, so therefore lighter skin color became dominant. This kind of change can happen fairly rapidly in a population over time. We're talking over maybe thousands and thousands of years, of course. I'm talking about geographical time. Not that it's going to happen in 1 or 2 generations. It would happen in many generations, but the point is, these changes are very minor changes genetically. They account for a very minute amount of the genetic material in our body, and in some cases are not even genetic changes. They're just switches that happen within our body that help determine whether or not our skin color is darker or lighter, whether our eye colors is darker, our hair color, and other minor features such as having longer noses in order to breathe in more air or colder air or whatever. So these are minor differences. They don't necessarily determine other things like behavioral characteristics or intelligence. So the ability to speak, the ability to add or make mathematical or even abstract reasoning, these are present in all human beings. And if there's any big variation within populations, those variations are much more likely to be within different within different groups. So, for example, most variation is actually within Africa because that was where the original human gene pool started. Groups that migrated north or out of Africa did mix with Neanderthals who were living in those areas before. So those groups have some Neanderthals. In that sense, there may be some variation. Again, still very, very small. So humans are far more heterogeneous than any other species. For example, if you compare the genetic variation between humans and you compare that to the variation between, for example, chimps or dogs and chimps have much more variation. As we can see with dogs, because dogs, for example, are bred deliberately to be different. And therefore, those differences in dog attributes and even dog behavior are deliberately caused and therefore have happened much more rapidly. So it's a mistake, which is what would happen in early biology, to look at dogs or horses and assume that the human active breeding characteristics from dogs and animals is the same as what's happened in humans, because in humans it's natural variation. Now, ethnicity is a different concept from race. Ethnicity deals with cultural differences between groups. So, for example, people in England and America speak English. People in Latin America speak Spanish. People in China speak Chinese. So those are different parts of different cultures. Other aspects of different cultures may be religion. There may also be different belief systems, different values and norms. So just as we talked about culture, differences between different cultures, these cultural differences become what we call ethnicity. Ethnicity simply means ethnos is people, the sense of culture or sense of self of a people. Now, we use ethnicity specifically within a given society to apply to groups that are ethnically or culturally different from the main group or the dominant group. So in America, the dominant group is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Typically people who originated in England, for example, right? So every other group is different culturally. Even Scottish immigrants, there are Dutch immigrants, German immigrants who came to America. All of them share different cultures. Then, of course, you have Hispanic immigrants, people from Latin America, Asian immigrants, and even African Americans, you could say, have a different culture. So ethnicity may overlap with our conceptions of race in some way, but that's not the purpose of the term ethnicity. It's to compare people in terms of cultural norms. So, for example, African Americans culturally, for the most part, are the same as white Americans. There's some cultural difference, one might say, but overall, those differences are largely rooted in their particular history in America, not rooted in their origin in Africa. Most African Americans, they speak English, they're Protestant. In other words, their cultural experience is actually very similar to that of white Americans. On the other hand, you have whites coming from Germany or from Denmark or from Spain who may have very different cultures. So the difference in culture is ethnicity. The difference in how people look, that is attributed to race. Now, of course, ethnicity has a very real impact on behavior. People have different customs, norms, and values. However, again, when we think of ethnocentricity, the assumption is that one ethnic group is superior to another. And that's a different matter. That's another question that we talked about earlier with ethnocentricity versus cultural relativity and the attempt to understand different cultures. The other thing is, of course, culture can be changed through assimilation. One can become similar to the dominant group. So many white ethnics in America have assimilated, they've blended in to the dominant group. Now, when we talk about, use the term a minority, we're speaking about a group that is distinctive in terms of its identity. Now, in terms, this can be, you notice the term imposed or self-defined. So sometimes a group will deliberately hold itself out as different. In other words, they'll define themselves as different based perhaps on racial factors, how they look, based perhaps on ethnic factors, what they believe. So, for example, if you're a member of an immigrant group, let's say Polish in America, and you've come with groups from your relatives or other people from your country, you may, for a while say, okay, I want to stick together with other Polish people because we don't really fully understand this thing called America. We don't understand the people here. They're all very nice, but maybe we need to help each other out. So they hold on to their distinctive identity. Other times it's imposed on them. So it may be that a group comes and they want to assimilate, but they're told, no, you're different. You're Irish, or you're German, you're a Catholic. We don't want you mixing. So in those cases, the distinctive identity is more imposed. Now, the key definite criteria of a minority is that it is subordinate, and that there's some level of separation and discrimination against the group. So minority status doesn't necessarily mean a numerical minority. It means a disadvantage of the group, that you have less power in society. It's like the legal term for a child is a minor. They're in their minority. They haven't become an adult yet. So it's really that meaning of the term minority rather than numerical minority. So, for example, in terms of gender, which we'll talk about later, women, even though there are more women than men in society, they're considered a minority because they have less power. Prejudice. Now, of course, you probably know what prejudice means. It's a belief in which we prejudge somebody based on either some characteristic like their race, their ethnicity, or something else about them. So if I see somebody coming down the street and I say, that person looks dangerous because they are X, Y, or Z, I'm prejudging them. I'm judging them before I know who they are. Typically, we assign this to the term stereotype. I look at them as if they're a copy of everybody else who looks like them, that they're all some way. Now, prejudice can be positive and negative. For example, if I'm prejudiced against a certain racial group, that means I'm prejudiced in favor of other racial groups, typically my own. Right? So I would say, I don't like these kind of people because they're not as good as my kind of people. Now, in functionalist theory, functionalism, remember, kind of assumes that cultures need to have some solidarity. So in order to have some solidarity, they must have some level of ethnocentrism. They must believe that their society is good or better even than other societies. So in functionalism, their argument is that historically, prejudice, or at least ethnocentrism was a positive thing because it reinforced the sense of group identity. It reinforced the need for the individual to identify with the group. However, functionalists generally agree that this becomes dysfunctional when it's applied inappropriately or when it's applied in a way to create conflict with other groups in society. So it can go both ways, but functionalists do tend to argue that there could be a beneficial aspect to ethnocentrism. Conflict theory, on the other hand, tends to argue that ethnocentrism, racism, and other forms of prejudice are basically simply a way of oppressing people. So it's an excuse for Marxists, specifically, who believe in class theory. So they don't necessarily believe that ethnicity or race are that important, but they say these things are used to help divide the working class, to help divide the lower classes. So, for example, if I have white workers and I have black workers, let's say I'm the capitalist class, my workers are divided, I can pit them against each other. That way they fight each other rather than fighting me. Right? They fight each other rather than fighting the system. Right? So that's one argument. The other argument is what Edna Barnasich calls split labor theory. In this argument, we give a privilege to one group of workers so that they support us, basically. So we'll go to white workers and say, oh, we'll give you a raise, we'll give you better working conditions, but in return, we're going to do this because we're white people, we're together, right? And then that will automatically get the workers to focus on their unity with us as capitalists, but other white people, versus other workers who they should be uniting with, right? Because they share with the other workers the common interest of being oppressed. But we give them some privileges so they don't feel oppressed. They feel like, oh, I'm privileged, I'm the white man. So this is what, for example, you could say happened in the American South. Right? Most Southerners never had slaves. They never benefited from slavery. On the contrary, they were oppressed by slavery, just like the slaves were, because they couldn't get jobs. They couldn't compete. They couldn't compete with the plantations. Right? But because they were white, they were given certain privileges, and then they felt like they had to defend these privileges. How do they defend them? By maintaining their sense of superiority to blacks in that case. So, and at the same time, then we have the split labor market. Of course, if I do need more workers, I could always go and hire black people. For example, if the whites go on strike, I can hire black people to replace them. Or if the economy booms and I need more workers, I can hire black people temporarily. Right? So in other words, I as the capitalist have all the advantages. Right? And I can basically play the different working groups like a fiddle. If they ever try to combine, I'll just go down there and spread more racist ideas, and next thing you know, they'll be fighting again. On the micro-sociological level, in terms of social psychology and ethnomethodology, symbolic interactionism, there are also a number of different theories of why prejudice or ethnocentrism occurs. Social psychology, for example, has several theories. One is the frustration scapegoat theory. So the argument here is that when the economy is doing bad or people are frustrated for some reason, they look for a scapegoat. They look for somebody to blame. And again, minority groups in Europe, historically, Jews were often attacked during periods of famine or during periods of economic depression. People would blame the Jews, and next thing you know, they'd be attacking Jewish communities. this is often tied to the concept of authoritarian personality, that some people need, are not fully developed, let us say, and that these types of people don't like to think for themselves. They like to be told what to do. So they're more comfortable in a situation where they're being told what to do. So when you combine them together, you have situations like during the Great Depression in the 1930s, there was the rise of a large number of extremist groups, many of them focusing on attacking minorities. So in the United States, you had a rebirth or reemergence of the KKK. In Europe, you had the Nazis. And in Japan, you also had racial theories against other Asian groups, such as the Chinese, and also other people in the world. In the United States, there's some evidence that there are connections between, for example, drop in cotton prices and increasing in lynchings in the American South. The basic logic is that if things are going badly, it's a lot easier to blame the powerless. So just like in ancient times, they would, when they wanted to sacrifice something to the gods because things aren't going well, you grab a goat. That's what, hence the word scapegoat. You blame everything on the goat and then you kill it. More in the symbolic interactions area, you have theories associated with implicit racism and symbolic racism. So symbolic racism means, certain deeply embedded values are associated with in a negative way with minority groups. So for example, you think about certain words in the English language, like, dark or black being negative things versus light or white, right? And so these terms, white be good, black bad, initially may not have anything to do with race, but then when you see somebody who has, for example, black skin, you suddenly, in your mind, it creates a symbolic association. And of course, again, these symbolism are manipulated and they recreated in everyday life. Some of them may be based on primitive ideas, such as, for example, darkness and nighttime. And almost every society in the world will associate darkness in a negative way because as humans, we're optical, we're visual creatures. So we feel a lot more comfortable in the daytime and we feel uncomfortable or less comfortable in the nighttime, particularly when you're out in the woods and there are creepy things flying around. Right? So some of it may be based on very, very ancient held beliefs, and then they get transported over into the field of race. Others may be simply not trusting people because they're a different religion, or they say things in a different way, so we don't understand them. Implicit racism is somewhat similar. So many people may not believe they're racist. They would say, "Oh, I'm not racist. I don't hate all black people. I don't hate all brown people." But yet they don't understand that racism is not about hating everybody in a group. It's about having a bias so that you're less likely to trust people from that group or another group. So it's like somebody who says, "I'm not racist, but black people commit more crime, therefore that's why they're in jail more." The point is, this argument is still repeating a bias and a stereotype that either are not true or need to be justified, need to be explained, right? So if you say more black people are poor, okay, that is a fact. But that fact is based on a long history of facts, right? A long history of reasons, right? So by the same token, if you were to say, well, Irish people, they're terrible because they came from Ireland in the Great Famine and they were all poor. Well, of course they were poor because the British took away their means of subsistence. They took away their land, they took away what they could grow, and they took away everything they could, right? So you can't blame a group for being in a position they're in as a result of racism or pre-existing racism. Now, discrimination is obviously a term we associate with prejudice, but keep in mind this key difference. Prejudice is a belief, discrimination is an act. So in discrimination, you are actively making a choice based on racial or ethnic differences, right? Now, on an individual level, it may be that your prejudice influences you to discriminate. But that may not be why people discriminate. In other words, there are also institutional reasons. So in other words, a bias or discrimination may be inherent in the operation of an organization or an institution. So for example, with regard to gender, most institutions simply denied women the very possibility of joining the institution. Right? You couldn't get a job, you couldn't be a fireman, you couldn't be a policeman, because by definition in the minds of the people in charge, women couldn't do those jobs. So therefore, the organization was inherently biased and discriminated against women. Individuals might say, I have nothing against women, but the rule says I can't allow women in, right? So that's institutional discrimination. Then you have structural discrimination. So this is what we were discussing before, when you have a situation where people are disadvantaged by previous acts of discrimination, then are unable to compete, right? That's structural discrimination. So the structure, the pre-existing structure, is creating a bias that continues into the future, right? And keep in mind, in the United States, discrimination was legally required in almost every state, I will say. I will not say every state because I cannot prove that, but almost every state until 1963. There were laws that said black people cannot do this, brown people cannot do that, Asian people cannot do other things, right? So if you were a police officer, or you were a teacher, or you were a librarian, or you were a simple ice cream soda jerk, your job was to make ice cream soda, your job was to discriminate. You could not sell an ice cream cone to a black person sitting in a restaurant in most southern states and many northern states up until the 1960s. And this was the rule. So when people say, oh, I would never discriminate, well, the fact is, every single American discriminated because they were told to by the law, right? I shouldn't say maybe every single one. Maybe there are a few people who stood up and said, I don't want this job as a soda jug because I don't want to discriminate against my fellow Americans. But believe you me, I bet those were very few and far between. So Robert Merton, remember him, he keeps popping up. That guy's pretty good, huh? He came up with this distinction between prejudice and discrimination. So if you take a 2x2 table like here, you see we have on the left, we have prejudice and not prejudice, right? And so prejudice and unprejudiced. So you may be prejudiced, but even though you're prejudiced, you don't discriminate. Why not? Well, maybe you're afraid to because the law says you can't discriminate. So he calls this the prejudiced non-discriminator or the timid bigot. They're bigoted, they're prejudiced, but they're afraid to actually act on their bigotry, right? And then you've got here the unprejudiced person who doesn't discriminate, right? So he's not prejudiced and he also doesn't discriminate. He's called the all-weather liberal. This is the person who will never discriminate, right? And we'll talk about how difficult that is. Then you got prejudiced people who discriminate, right? We can call that the all-weather bigot, right? The all-weather bigot, he discriminates because he's prejudiced and he refuses to not discriminate, right? And then you've got up here the unprejudiced person who does discriminate. You say, well, why does he discriminate? Because, like I said, maybe it's the law, right? So a black person goes to a library, the librarian is, let's say, not prejudiced. The librarian, or at least they're going to claim, right? They'll always, oh, I'm not prejudiced, but the law says you can't use the library, right? So that would be your fair weather liberal. They're not prejudiced, but they discriminate. So they're liberal, but they're only a liberal when it's easy to be a liberal. Now, just think about this for a second, right? Now, before the 1960s, like I said, it was the law in this country, in America, that is, to discriminate. That was the law, right? So people fit, 99% of people fit into this box. They discriminated, right? They followed the law, right? So whether they were a prejudiced discriminator, or whether bigot, or they were an unprejudiced discriminator, they didn't discriminate, but they would go along with the law because that's what the law said. They're going to follow the rules, right? Now, after the 60s, you had the 70s, and suddenly the laws changed to a certain extent. The law said, in many cases, you cannot discriminate in housing, in schools, in libraries, in parks. In other words, it kind of turned around the whole picture. So now, instead of 90% of people being here, now 90% of people are here. Right? So this is pre-60s or so, and this is post all right? So I'm not going to say that 90% of people did not discriminate, because a lot of people, they were so used to discriminate, they felt that was the right thing to do, right? These people down here in this box, the prejudiced discriminator, they felt that was the right thing to do, because when you grow up in a system, you just assume it's correct. You don't question it, right? Just when I was a child, I grew up in the 60s. I mean, it didn't make sense to me, but it just, if there was a rule, well, there must be a reason for the rule, right? Now, my parents were quite liberal. I'm not sure if I would call them all-weather liberals, but they were pretty liberal, and they did buck the system in the 50s and 60s. They were part of the civil rights movement, at least in a way, right? But I don't know how far they ever went out on the limb. Right? But the point I'm making here is, if you think about it, for most people to switch from discriminating because they were told to not discriminating when they were told to, that means most people are either here or here. You probably have only a small percentage of the population who are here or here. Maybe 5, maybe 10%, right? These are the people who are willing to sacrifice for their beliefs, right? Maybe it's more, maybe 20%, right? But then that means most Americans are pretty happy going along either way. They'll get used to it, right? And that's a scary thought, so, because if you think that issues of prejudice and discrimination have been dealt with, you're living in a fantasy land, because this is the reality we are facing. Most Americans would be quite happy going one way or the other, right? Think about it. So this is what institutional discrimination is, what we call the self-fulfilling prophecy. Like I said before, if you have a group that starts off at stage 1, they're facing prejudice and discrimination. At stage 2, they are going to be socially disadvantaged. They can't get into the right schools. they can't get the good jobs, they can't live in good neighborhoods, right? This then is going to carry on to stage 3. Of course, they're not going to do as well as a group, right? So then everybody says, well, see, that's what we told you. They're inferior. They can't compete, right? And then, of course, that goes ahead and reinforces the prejudice and the discrimination. So this is what we call structural discrimination. The structure of society is reproducing that discrimination on a regular basis. We're going to have to leave it there because it's getting a bit late. Join us next lecture. We'll continue with our discussion of patterns of racism.